just start with the first project in the session, and I was told to keep within a limited space so that people online can see me, so I will try to not walk around, otherwise I would prefer to, but I will stay in the camera angle. So this project, Accelerating Digitalization Through Data, has been running in Software Center for very many years by now. We have had great collaborations over the years, and we still do. We typically talk about the companies that are very active and that we interact with on a continuous basis. This sprint, these are the primary ones. We have also companies that are listening in, interested, taking part maybe in taking part of some of the work. They are also a nice group of companies. So we are actually really happy for engagement in this project during this sprint. The project is all about data-driven development, and I thought the previous speakers of today were really interesting because they all bring up the relevance, the importance, and the necessity of having access to real-time data from products in the field, the notion of getting to know the customers, what they appreciate, and what they find and what they define as value in the products and in the features that you deliver. In this project, we have for a long time been working on something that we call value design. I will talk a little bit about it, but what it is a technique to help teams, organizations agree on what the key metrics are that you look to improve. So what is it really that we try to achieve as a business? And what do we need to together work towards? What do we optimize? Overall scope, increase the adoption of data-driven development practices with the intention to accelerate digitalization in these companies. And as a typical picture when presenting this project, we tend to use this one. It basically communicates that close to half of the features in a typical software system are never used, or at least very seldomly so. The unfortunate situation is, at least what we hear from many of the companies today, is that even if this is a very old picture, it is still somewhat true. Which is then, of course, a situation you would want to move away from. You would at least want to know what features in your systems are used and what features are not used. So that's sort of the basics. Another picture that we often use is this one, where we have asked well above 50 companies by now how much of their R&D resources that are spent on commodity functionality. And the response, between 70 to 90% of all R&D efforts go into commodity functionality, things that customers do not view as value, but rather they should just work. So with this as a background, I think it is pretty clear that there is the need for methods, techniques, mechanisms that help us better understand what customer value is and how customers actually appreciate, use, and view our products. And this is where the whole notion of, for example, A/B testing comes into practice. We all know it from the online space, where the basic thing is that you typically have customers divided into groups and you experiment with different versions of, for example, a feature to learn and collect data on how customers use the different versions. In B2B, this is of course different. We cannot use A/B testing in exactly the similar ways, but with connected products, with increasing amounts of data coming back from the field, there are lots of opportunities. And over the years, and as part of this project, we have seen great interest and also increasing adoption within the software center companies on how to actually go about and run experiments. Of course, the metrics here are different if you would compare with the online domain. Here it can be about performance, security, reliability, robustness, all kinds of things. We do realize these are difficult. It's not dissimilar to the online companies, but there are opportunities for data-driven development practices and experimentation also in this space. But what you need, and what we have realized is really difficult, if you would want to assess whether or not, for example, an experiment is successful or not, you need to know what it is you seek to improve. So you need to know which one of these is actually more important than the other. What is it that we optimize for? And that's where value design comes into play as one technique where you look to identify metrics at different levels in an organization. We have the team, the feature level. We have the product level metrics. And at the top, we have the business level KPIs. Ideally, these align so that you have a hierarchical system with a few business level KPIs that then translates to product and to feature level KPIs. So that as a team, you by the end of the day know that what we did today contribute with what the business seeks to achieve. Is it easy? Not so much. So, I mean, there are lots of challenges within this space, and there is a text box, so you might not be able to read it, but what it says is, and what we see is that very often the discussions on what are we looking to optimize turn into more of a, I don't know, fighting defensive mode where different roles within an organization pretend or protect is the word I'm looking for, protect their own metrics, for example. It is also a bit of a political fight or conflict or discussion at times. So, I mean, there are lots of different and difficult things involved in agreeing on this. For good reasons. I mean, if we look at the software center companies, for example, most of these companies were based on, they are requirements driven. So you are organized typically to deal with and to manage and to successfully work around requirements, much more than what you are organized to be outcome driven, outcome oriented. So there are lots of things also with pure organization that make an outcome driven, data driven approach more difficult to just adopt and make effective use of. There are lots of other reasons why value design is difficult, but what we realized during the recent sprint is that maybe we should revisit the basics. Since it is very difficult to agree on what to optimize for, how to make effective use of a technique such as value design, why not take a step back and look into what data is actually available? What is it that we collect? And how do we make use of it? And without making this a too long story, we basically went out to the companies, revisited these basic questions, and made a little bit of a current state mapping. And what we see is that, of course, there are huge amounts of data being collected from products in the field. There are good infrastructures in place, but typically metrics tend to focus on, for example, performance, more quality-oriented. They tend to still concern feature usage rather than the surrounding context. So you could tell whether a feature is used or not, but you couldn't really say much more. So it's very difficult to analyze what usage pattern, for example, or what was a situation that triggered a certain action of a feature being activated. Those things are more difficult to tell. Metrics also tend to represent current state in that, you know, once we had this requirement, it said this and that is what the metric then measure, rather than What is it that we would want the system to do for us? What is it that we expect from the system? And very often metrics that are in place are very difficult to change. If we look at the online space, you experiment with metrics. They have to prove their value over time. Whereas very many B2B companies have metrics in place, they tend to be cast in stone and they are difficult to remove or change over time. There are lots of challenges as we know the software center companies. I mean, one, I think we touched upon it already. You have qualitative understandings of your customers. You have quantitative data coming in. How do you really combine these? How do you learn from your internal data sources in combination with external data coming into the company? How can you learn from data that is generated on a very frequent basis at the same time as you learn from data generated on a less frequent basis? Those types of questions arise in the majority of the software center companies. Another thing is we have the DevOps in place, we have metrics in place, we can collect data, but if we look at the overall, are there ways in which we know if things are overall improving? We might be able to tell if a certain part of a system or a feature or something smaller is actually improving. But do we know, and how do we know if things are overall improving? Those are typical challenges. So just to summarize, very often we see the wrong data being collected, meaning that there is lots of data, but not really the things you need as the basis for decision making. Very often it's also data that is somewhat convenient to collect in the sense that it was the things we used to collect. It has been historically collected, but it might not be ideal for the decision-making processes we would want to. So that is a little bit of where we spent time during the last sprint to revisit data collection practices and use. We also, and with regards to value design and KPIs and this space, we see a few, let's call them anti-patterns, but typical things that tend to happen in companies. So one is what we have been talking about as the worthwhile many and the versus the vital few. Situations in where a lack of a shared understanding of what is the key factors, the key metrics to improve. People in organization tend to spend lots of time on the worthwhile many, those things that are important, but they don't really add direct value to the success of the business. The vital few, on the other hand, is the minority of an organization, the minority of the teams that really spend time on things that directly contribute to value and success. And this happens when there is no shared understanding of what is actually those vital few. I won't go into all the details here, but another pattern that we see, and which is also based on the fact that many times there is a lack of an understanding of the desired outcome, is where I think we all know the Alice in Wonderland expression, if you don't know where you're going, any road will take you there. Basically, teams improve the metrics they feel are relevant with the risk of sub-optimization in the entire system. So there are different anti-patterns that easily come into play when we don't have an agreed upon goal. This is another graph representing how the situation might often play out. In the beginning, there is a very simplistic value model, you could say, in the sense that there are a few metrics that people take as a given. They might even be implicit. You just know they are there. If you look at the online space, the example here would be conversion. It's a simplistic metric. Everyone knows it. You don't really have to communicate it, but that's the one metric. Over time, teams add metrics to a state where things start to become somewhat confusing because it is still implicit. You don't really share. Everyone in the organization are not aware. But instead, you move to a situations where KPIs are added, but there is no alignment in between teams. So a somewhat confusing stage with lots of metrics being added. Where you would want to be is, of course, in a stage where you have all these metrics, the more elaborate, but where they are explicit, so that people within the organization actually know what we are working towards. If going back to the anti-pattern, that would be the vital few. That's where teams would be able to organize around a shared understanding of the metrics, while what we often see, KPIs are added, but with no one knowing. That's where people tend to spend time on the worthwhile many. We all do our things that we think are important, but we don't share a common view on what are the key factors. So this is a little bit to outline maybe the negatives or the not so nice things about data collection and use within the organizations that we see today, but with, let's call it, lots of room for improvement, and where data collection practices could be used in a much more efficient way. During the sprint, we have had a number of publications, and what I would want to also share is a little bit on the future and where we wish to spend our time. Based on what we see and what I just presented in terms of challenges within data collection and use, we would want to, with you, engage in research that would support the situation on how to better combine and make effective use of data. With a holistic view, trying to learn from different data sources, different cycles in which data is collected, etc., to bring a better understanding for how to work with data for decision making. Frameworks, methods, and best practices, those are typically the deliverables from this project, and that's what we aim for this sprint as well. And with those words, and leaving at least 1 minute for a potential question, and of course, it is not only me in this project, we are 2 researchers, and this is us, and thank you very much. And I don't know if there is a question, Robert?
Robert, wait a second. I'm on my way. I'm getting too old for this stuff, but who's counting?
So thank you, Helena, for a nice presentation and summary. So I was thinking about one area. So when we have looked at this project before, we have, or at least I have usually thought about, we look at the business metrics. We look at data from our customer to understand the customer value. But then you also showed some picture that we have also, apart from the customer metrics, we of course also have the internal metrics. And one discussion we have a lot in around the Accelerate KPI is that these are somehow internal metrics that we assume then have the impact on the customer metrics, so to say. What in your view would be preferable? Would we rather only look at customer metrics and try to connect our development teams towards that metrics, like income or customer satisfaction? Or should we try to also find what is the internal enabler metrics, and then we use those to measure our internal development? If that makes sense.
It makes perfect sense. I think you actually touch upon one of the things that we would really wish to look into more, because those two, I don't think that you are the only ones with those types of metrics. I think the internal part makes very good sense for the organization. I think you need them. also the external, in this case the customer, of course, are super important for you, but they are also different types of metrics. They do feed into each other, but I also can foresee situations and features for which maybe what you refer to as internal is more important when it comes to, for example, performance of a system. But depending on what you would wish to achieve, in some situations, the customer's KPIs are critical. Say, I mean, we typically use AB Volvo as an example. If you would want to monetize based on how well you fulfill, for example, delivery on time, which is super critical for that customer, then a customer KPI is of high importance. While if you then look at a feature reflecting performance of the system, well, then maybe internal KPIs are the ones, in this case, as you described them, that are most important. So they work together, yes.
Because my view is, it has to start from the customer. If you do not deliver value to the customer, you don't have any opportunity to capture part of the value that you deliver to the customer. And you saw Helena's hierarchical value model. So for me, the top level KPIs are typically the customer KPIs and your top level business KPIs. And then the internal KPIs can be below that. But the big problem or the big challenge is, so if you, I don't know if you have the slide handy by any chance, but the big challenge is, how do you link your internal KPIs to the outcome top level KPIs, so you actually know that if you focus on those internal KPIs, this is the slide I was looking for. And that's where we are looking for ways, and there actually are ways to look at that, where you try to establish quantitative relationships between the metrics on the different levels.
Yeah.
You want to follow up?
No, I think that makes sense. That is how I maybe see it as well, because it's very hard to connect the developer to a global. We have that in the bonus system. If we connect it to the overall big company bonus, people tend to say, oh, I cannot affect it. So we somehow need to come down. But I like that answer too.
And I mean, one example would be, and this is quite recent in one company, then the top level KPI was peace of mind. And so what would a development team at your end do to deliver on peace of mind? What does it mean? So there comes the translation. And then you find finally that, of course, peace of mind translates into a number of things, concrete and tangible for a team. But if they are implicit, that team would do something completely different, I'm pretty sure.
Any other questions? You all look so calm. This is the hour. Oh, there's Anna. Anna makes me run. I mean, after lunch, you know, all your blood flows to your stomach and you get really sleepy, except for Anna.
Yeah, sure. Thank you for that one. Thank you, Helena. It's very interesting. You talked about also a little about who is looking at what data to make sense of it. How do you, this model we have, and there is someone setting these KPIs, and have you looked into that in this project, or who is actually making sense of what we produce in this system? How do we take it to the decisions and executions and actually into the backlogs, what we learn from it? Or are we just looking at what we should have and look at? Where are you on?
Yeah, that's actually a really good question. I cannot really say that that is something that I study that much, but what I do know is that, for example, many companies experience the team and feature level metrics as quite mature, at least they are there. The same goes for the business ones, but there seems to be an empty space in the middle.
Yeah.
I don't know what that means in terms of the analytics part,
No.
but if you have a layer that is missing, I would assume that you can do all kinds of analytics at the team and feature level without really being able to translate it all the way. I also know that dashboards don't necessarily help teams understand how well they align and contribute to the top level KPIs. So in my view, there is at least a gap. And then on the other hand, I do realize that at the team level, you don't always have the holistic perspective. But I mean, that's exactly what we would want to achieve. For decision making, you do need, I think, data at all different levels. And here, this data in itself is difficult to be the only source used for decision making. You need something in addition. But maybe you want to add.
No, no,
Uh,
no.
yeah.
Ja,